The fastest way to lose a fortune is to underestimate the person holding the pen. On a gray Tuesday morning in downtown Chicago, the glass headquarters of Nexus Dynamics buzzed with the kind of energy that only comes before a make-or-break deal. Executives hurried through the lobby carrying tablets, assistants checked schedules down to the minute, and investors from across the country were arriving for what many believed would be the most important funding meeting in the company's history. At exactly 8:12 a.m. A black SUV pulled up to the front entrance. Monica Carter stepped out wearing a navy business suit, carrying a slim leather portfolio and nothing else. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone who never needed to announce herself. The security guard near the revolving doors glanced at her visitor badge request, then looked past her shoulder as if expecting someone else to emerge from the vehicle. "Delivery entrance is around the back," he said casually. Monica paused for a moment. "I'm here for the executive board meeting," she replied politely. The guard frowned and checked his tablet again. "The investor meeting?" he asked. "That's right." He looked uncertain, then nodded toward a waiting area near the wall. "You can have a seat there while we figure it out." Monica thanked him and walked over without complaint. Around her, several executives arriving after her were greeted immediately and escorted upstairs. 10 minutes later, Monica remained seated while employees rushed through the lobby carrying coffee and presentation materials. She watched everything carefully, occasionally checking the time on her watch. She never appeared annoyed. She never raised her voice. She simply observed. Upstairs, the executive team was preparing for a meeting that could change the company forever. Nexus Dynamics had spent months pursuing a massive investment package that would fund expansion into new markets and nearly double the company's valuation. CEO Richard Collins had told everyone the deal was essential. Without it, growth projections would stall. With it, the company could dominate the industry. Down in the lobby, however, nobody seemed particularly interested in Monica Carter. A receptionist eventually approached and asked whether she was accompanying one of the investors. Monica smiled. "No," she said. "I'm attending the meeting myself." The receptionist gave a polite nod but looked visibly confused. A few moments later, another employee arrived and asked Monica if she needed help setting up presentation materials for the executives upstairs. Monica thanked him and declined. Again, she remained calm. Again, she said nothing more than necessary. By 8:37 a.m., several people had spoken to Monica. Not one had asked her actual role. Not one had considered the possibility that she might be more important than everyone rushing around her. And as the clock ticked closer to the start of the meeting, Monica sat quietly in the lobby while the future of Nexus Dynamics waited just a few floors above her, hidden in plain sight. At 8:41 a.m., a young operations manager named Ethan Brooks stepped into the lobby carrying a stack of folders and nearly stopped in his tracks when he noticed Monica still sitting in the waiting area. He had attended enough industry conferences to recognize faces, and although he had only seen her a handful of times in business publications, he was almost certain he knew exactly who she was. Ethan glanced at the receptionist, then back at Monica. "Ma'am, have they not taken you upstairs yet?" he asked carefully. Monica looked up from her notes and offered a calm smile. "Not yet." Ethan hesitated. Something about the situation felt wrong. The executive board meeting had been scheduled to begin in less than 20 minutes, and every senior leader in the company had been told that representatives connected to a major investment group would be attending. Yet the woman sitting quietly in front of him appeared to be receiving less attention than a courier delivering office supplies. Before Ethan could say anything else, his phone buzzed. A message from upstairs instructed him to bring revised financial projections to the conference room immediately. He nodded politely to Monica and hurried toward the elevator, but the image stayed with him. On the 32nd floor, preparations were reaching a fever pitch. Richard Collins stood at the head of the massive conference table reviewing slides projected across a wall-sized screen. The numbers looked promising, but everyone knew the truth. The company needed fresh capital. Expansion plans, hiring goals, and product development timelines all depended on securing the funding package executives had spent months chasing. Richard straightened his tie and addressed the room. "Today changes everything," he said confidently. Once this investment is finalized, we move into an entirely different league. Several board members nodded. Others exchanged cautious glances. The stakes were enormous. Back downstairs, Monica finally received a temporary badge. A different employee escorted her toward the executive elevators, but stopped just short of accompanying her to the conference floor. "The meeting room is at the end of the hall," he explained quickly before rushing away. Monica thanked him and stepped into the elevator alone. As the doors closed, she reviewed several pages inside her portfolio. Her expression never changed. She appeared completely relaxed despite the unusual start to the morning. When the elevator opened, activity filled the hallway. Staff members moved in and out of offices carrying reports and laptops. Hardly anyone paid attention to Monica as she walked toward the conference room. Through the glass walls, she could already see senior executives gathering around the table. At exactly 8:58 a.m., Monica entered the room. Conversations continued. Nobody stood. Nobody greeted her. Richard Collins was speaking with two board members and did not even glance in her direction. After a few awkward seconds, an assistant pointed toward an empty chair positioned near the far end of the table, noticeably farther from the decision-makers than the primary seats. "You can sit there," she said politely. Monica thanked her and took the seat without objection. Around the room, discussions continued as if nothing unusual had happened. But from across the table, Ethan Brooks had just entered with the financial reports. The moment he saw Monica sitting at the far end of the room, his stomach tightened. He suddenly realized that nobody else seemed to know who was actually sitting among them. At precisely 9 a.m., Richard Collins called the meeting to order and immediately took control of the room. A large presentation filled the screen behind him as he began outlining Nexus Dynamics' growth strategy for the next 5 years. Revenue forecasts, expansion targets, and market projections appeared one after another. Richard spoke with confidence, and most of the executives around the table listened carefully. Monica remained quiet, reviewing the documents she had brought with her. For the first 15 minutes, Richard never acknowledged her presence. He introduced board members, senior executives, consultants, and outside advisors. Several people were welcomed by name. Monica was not. Ethan Brooks noticed it immediately. Each time Richard recognized someone at the table, Ethan expected him to eventually turn toward Monica. That moment never came. As the discussion moved into financial planning, one board member raised concerns about cash flow projections tied to the company's expansion strategy. Before anyone else responded, Monica looked up from her notes. "The assumptions behind those projections appear optimistic compared to current industry conditions," she said calmly. Her voice was measured and professional. Several people glanced toward her. The observation was brief but thoughtful. Richard barely looked in her direction. "We have already reviewed those numbers extensively," he replied before turning back toward the board member who had spoken. "As I was saying, our internal analysis supports the forecast." The conversation continued as if Monica had never spoken. She simply nodded and returned to her notes. A few minutes later, another executive raised questions about acquisition costs in 2 new markets. Once again, Monica offered a concise observation. "Have those estimates been stress-tested under higher interest rate scenarios?" she asked. This time, Richard interrupted before she could elaborate. "Our finance team has that covered," he said. "We can move on." The room grew slightly quieter. Some executives exchanged brief glances. The pattern was becoming difficult to ignore. Monica was not challenging anyone. She was asking the same type of questions any experienced investor would ask. Yet each time she spoke, Richard found a reason to redirect the discussion elsewhere. Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The more he listened, the more concerned he became. Richard continued presenting growth plans worth hundreds of millions of dollars while dismissing some of the most relevant questions being raised in the room. Nearly 30 minutes into the meeting, the conversation turned toward the company's funding requirements. Richard stood beside the screen and pointed to a slide detailing future capital needs. "Securing the right investment partner is critical," he said. "We need people who understand long-term vision and have the confidence to support leadership decisions. Several board members nodded. Monica quietly wrote something in her notebook. Richard noticed the movement and finally looked directly at her for the first time that morning. "We will have time for additional comments later," he said. "Right now, I would like to hear from the decision-makers." The words hung in the air for a moment. A few people shifted in their seats. Ethan lowered his eyes toward the table. Monica did not react. She simply closed her notebook, folded her hands calmly, and listened as the meeting continued. But for the first time, several people around the room were beginning to wonder whether the biggest risk facing Nexus Dynamics was not the market, the competition, or the economy. It might be sitting at the head of the table. The meeting moved deeper into operational strategy, and with every passing minute the atmosphere became more uncomfortable for those paying close attention. Richard Collins continued controlling the conversation with absolute confidence, but his focus seemed increasingly narrow. Whenever a senior executive spoke, he engaged. Whenever a board member raised a concern, he responded. Whenever Monica attempted to contribute, he found a way to move on. The pattern was subtle enough that nobody could point to a single dramatic moment, yet obvious enough that several people around the table had begun noticing it. A vice president responsible for market expansion presented a report showing projected growth across 3 major regions. The numbers looked impressive at first glance, but several assumptions appeared unusually aggressive. Monica reviewed the slide for a few seconds before speaking. "What contingency plans are in place if customer acquisition costs increase beyond forecast levels?" she asked. The question was straightforward. It was the kind of question any serious investor would ask before committing significant capital. Before the vice president could answer, Richard stepped in. "Our team has already evaluated multiple scenarios," he said. "I think we should stay focused on the broader vision." Monica nodded once and said nothing further. A few minutes later, another executive discussed hiring plans that would require substantial increases in operating expenses. Monica quietly raised another concern. "Have retention costs been included in those projections?" she asked. Again, Richard answered instead of the presenter. "The details are under control," he said. "We do not need to get lost in operational weeds today." This time, a board member glanced toward Monica with visible curiosity. The question had been reasonable. In fact, it was exactly the type of question the board itself should have been asking. Yet somehow it had been brushed aside again. Ethan Brooks watched the exchange carefully. He could almost feel tension building beneath the surface of the room. Richard appeared unaware of it. The more confident he became, the more dismissive he sounded. As the discussion shifted toward future financing requirements, Richard began outlining the company's need for long-term investment partners. He spoke passionately about leadership, trust, and strategic vision. "The right investors understand when to support management," he said. "They know when to trust experienced leadership rather than challenge every decision." Several people listened quietly. Monica wrote another note inside her portfolio. Richard noticed her writing and smiled slightly. "Someone seems busy taking notes," he said. A few people chuckled politely. Monica looked up and returned a courteous smile. "I always take notes during important meetings," she replied. Richard nodded dismissively before turning back toward the presentation. The comment seemed harmless on the surface, but it added to a growing sense that he viewed her differently from everyone else in the room. Near the far end of the table, one board member discreetly opened a search page on his phone. Another followed moments later. Neither said a word. Both had become increasingly curious about the woman whose questions sounded more insightful than many of the presentations being delivered. Meanwhile, Monica remained calm, composed, and patient. She never interrupted. She never challenged Richard directly. She simply observed. And while Richard believed he was demonstrating authority in front of potential investors, several people around the table were beginning to wonder whether the most important evaluation happening that morning was not the company assessing an investor, but an investor quietly assessing the company. As the meeting approached its second hour, the discussion shifted from projections and strategy to risk management, an area where even small mistakes could cost companies millions of dollars. For the first time that morning, several board members began asking tougher questions. One director wanted clarification about debt exposure during a potential market slowdown. Another questioned whether the company's expansion timeline was realistic given current economic conditions. Richard Collins answered each concern with the same confidence he had displayed all morning. But the room no longer felt as comfortable as it had at the start. The questions were becoming sharper, and the answers seemed increasingly polished rather than specific. Monica continued listening quietly. She occasionally wrote notes, reviewed documents, and observed the reactions of everyone around the table. Her calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the growing tension among several executives. Ethan Brooks noticed that two board members were still occasionally looking at their phones. Whatever they were researching appeared to hold their attention. Then another presentation slide appeared on the screen showing long-term capital allocation plans. Richard proudly described how the company intended to deploy future investment funds over the next several years. He spoke about innovation initiatives, market expansion, infrastructure upgrades, and acquisitions. When he finished, silence filled the room for a moment. Monica finally raised her hand slightly. "May I ask a question regarding the capital allocation model?" she said politely. Richard hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Briefly," he replied. Monica nodded. "If revenue growth falls even 10% below projections during the first 18 months, what safeguards exist to prevent liquidity pressure during the acquisition phase?" The room became very quiet. Unlike previous questions, this one was highly specific. Several executives immediately looked toward the finance team. A few people began reviewing the slide more carefully. It was an important question. Richard smiled. "That scenario is extremely unlikely," he said. Monica maintained her calm expression. "Perhaps," she replied. "But unlikely scenarios are often the reason risk models exist." A few board members exchanged glances. One director slowly nodded. Richard cleared his throat and moved to the next slide without directly addressing the concern. For the first time all morning, the avoidance felt obvious. Ethan could see it. The board could see it. Even some senior executives appeared uncomfortable. Yet Monica showed no sign of frustration. She simply allowed the conversation to continue. The contrast was becoming impossible to ignore. Richard appeared increasingly determined to control the discussion, while Monica seemed interested only in understanding the company. Minutes later, one of the directors who had been searching on his phone suddenly sat upright. His expression changed instantly. He looked across the table at Monica, then back down at his screen. A second director noticed the reaction and leaned over to look. Within seconds, both men were staring at the same information. Neither spoke, neither interrupted, but their faces revealed something important. They had discovered who Monica really was, or at least enough to realize that everyone else in the room might be making a serious mistake. Meanwhile, Richard continued presenting as though nothing had changed, completely unaware that the balance of the meeting was beginning to shift beneath his feet. Richard Collins advanced to the next section of the presentation with renewed confidence, unaware that attention inside the room had begun shifting away from his slides and toward the woman seated near the end of the table. The discussion now focused on funding requirements for the next phase of growth. A chart appeared showing projected capital needs over the next 36 months. The numbers were enormous. New facilities, technology investments, acquisitions, and hiring plans would require a level of financial support the company had never secured before. Richard stood beside the screen and spoke with enthusiasm. "This is the opportunity that separates market leaders from everyone else," he said. "With the right investment partner, we can accelerate growth and dominate key sectors before competitors have a chance to react." Several executives nodded. The message was compelling. But as Richard continued, he became increasingly candid about how much the company needed outside capital. "Frankly," he said, "the funding package we are pursuing changes everything. Without it, expansion slows considerably. With it, we can move years ahead of schedule." Monica listened quietly. She had heard countless presentations like this throughout her career. Some were impressive. Some were exaggerated. The most revealing moments usually came when leaders became comfortable enough to stop choosing their words carefully. Richard continued speaking. We are looking for investors who trust leadership and understand how successful companies operate. Too many investors focus on details that ultimately do not matter. Several board members shifted slightly in their seats. The comment landed differently after the questions Monica had asked earlier. One director looked down at his phone again, reviewing information he had discovered. Another quietly exchanged a glance with him. Neither seemed comfortable. Richard moved to a slide showing projected returns. The real challenge, he continued, is finding partners capable of thinking at this level. Then he laughed lightly and added, not everyone in the room will appreciate the scale of what we are building. The remark was intended as a joke, but a few people immediately looked toward Monica. She remained composed, showing no reaction whatsoever. Ethan Brooks felt a knot forming in his stomach. He knew Richard believed he was demonstrating authority. Instead, each comment seemed to deepen a problem he could not see. A board member finally raised a question about investor expectations. What level of oversight would management be willing to accept from a major capital partner? He asked. Richard answered immediately. We welcome collaboration, of course, but leadership decisions should remain with leadership. Investors invest because they trust executives to execute. Monica slowly closed a document and looked toward the presentation screen. For a brief moment, her eyes rested on a series of financial assumptions displayed near the bottom of a chart. Then she returned to listening. Across the table, the two directors who had researched her background appeared increasingly unsettled. One of them opened a professional profile page again just to confirm what he was seeing. The information had not changed. The realization was still there. Meanwhile, Richard continued explaining why the company deserved extraordinary confidence from potential investors. What he did not realize was that the person most qualified to evaluate that claim had been sitting quietly in front of him for nearly 2 hours, watching every decision, every comment, and every missed opportunity. The meeting entered what Richard Collins considered its strongest phase. The presentations were finished, the financial projections had been reviewed, and he believed the room had seen exactly what he wanted them to see. What he did not realize was that several people were no longer evaluating the slides on the screen. They were evaluating him. One of the directors who had been quietly researching Monica finally closed his phone and leaned back in his chair. The information he had found was difficult to ignore. He had expected to discover that Monica worked for a consulting firm or perhaps represented a financial advisory group. Instead, he had uncovered a career that included billion-dollar transactions, board appointments at major corporations, and a reputation for identifying leadership risks before other investors noticed them. The more he read, the more uncomfortable he became. Across the room, another director had reached the same conclusion. Neither man interrupted the meeting. Neither wanted to create a scene. But both were beginning to understand that the person Richard had repeatedly dismissed might be the most experienced voice at the table. Meanwhile, Richard continued speaking about future growth opportunities. Our leadership team has consistently delivered results, he said confidently. We know where this company is going. Monica listened without expression. She had spent years evaluating executives. The strongest leaders usually invited difficult questions. They understood that scrutiny was part of building trust. The weakest leaders often viewed questions as challenges to their authority. She was still deciding which category Richard belonged to. A board member raised concerns about execution risk during rapid expansion. Before Richard could answer, Monica spoke. What mechanisms are in place to ensure accountability if key performance targets are missed during the first year? Her tone remained calm and professional. The question was direct but entirely reasonable. For a moment, nobody spoke. Several executives looked toward Richard. Instead of addressing the question, he smiled politely. That level of detail is typically handled internally, he replied. Today we are focused on the bigger picture. Monica nodded once. Understood, she said. The exchange lasted only seconds, yet it changed the atmosphere in the room. Some executives appeared frustrated. Others seemed puzzled. The question had not been difficult. In fact, it was exactly the type of issue responsible investors should examine before committing significant resources. Ethan Brooks watched from the side of the room and could almost feel the tension growing. He had never seen a meeting unfold quite like this. Monica remained respectful. Richard remained dismissive. And with each interaction, the contrast became sharper. Then something unexpected happened. One of the directors who had researched Monica cleared his throat and looked directly toward her. "I would actually be interested in hearing your perspective on that question," he said. The room became silent. Several heads turned. For the first time all morning, someone had openly invited Monica to expand on her analysis. Richard's expression tightened slightly before returning to normal. Monica closed her notebook and looked around the table. She was not smiling. She was not angry. She simply appeared prepared. And for the first time since the meeting began, several people in the room seemed genuinely interested in what she had to say. For a brief moment, nobody moved. The room seemed to pause as attention shifted toward Monica. Richard Collins remained standing near the screen, his expression carefully controlled, but several people noticed the change in posture. He was no longer directing every part of the conversation. For the first time that morning, someone else had been invited to speak. Monica looked toward the director who had asked for her perspective and gave a small nod. "Thank you," she said calmly. She opened her notebook and glanced at a few notes before continuing. "The question regarding accountability is important because growth projections only matter if leadership has a system for recognizing problems early." Her voice was steady and confident. "Most companies prepare for success. Fewer prepare for the possibility that assumptions may be wrong." Several board members leaned forward slightly. Monica continued, "When expansion targets are missed, investors generally examine 3 areas first: leadership response time, financial flexibility, and internal reporting transparency. If any one of those areas is weak, small issues can become expensive problems very quickly." Nobody interrupted her. In fact, several executives appeared more engaged than they had been during the previous hour. Monica was not speaking in abstract business language. She was discussing practical realities, the kind that experienced investors cared about. Richard folded his arms. "Those risks exist in every company," he said. "That is not unique to our situation." Monica nodded. "That is true," she replied, "which is why strong governance becomes such a competitive advantage." The answer was respectful. It was also difficult to argue with. One director smiled slightly. Another quietly wrote notes of his own. The atmosphere inside the room continued to shift. Ethan Brooks could see it happening in real time. People who had barely acknowledged Monica earlier were now listening carefully to every sentence. A board member near the center of the table spoke next. "You mentioned reporting transparency. What specifically would you want to see?" Monica answered immediately. "I would want clear reporting structures, measurable accountability standards, and leadership willing to discuss weaknesses as openly as strengths. Investors rarely lose confidence because problems exist. They lose confidence when problems are hidden." Several heads nodded around the room. Even some executives who worked under Richard seemed to agree. The conversation was becoming less about slides and more about leadership. Richard attempted to regain control. "Fortunately, our company has a strong track record," he said. "Results speak for themselves." Monica looked toward the screen displaying growth forecasts. "Past results matter," she said, "but future capital depends on future trust." The room became quiet again. It was not a dramatic statement. It was simply true. And because it was true, it carried weight. Across the table, the directors who had researched Monica exchanged another glance. They knew far more than most people in the room. They knew the woman speaking had helped oversee investments worth billions of dollars. They knew she sat on multiple corporate boards. They knew that executives across the country sought her opinion before making major decisions. Yet Richard still appeared unaware. He continued treating her as though she were a minor participant in the meeting. And with every passing minute, that mistake was becoming more visible to everyone else. By the time Monica finished answering questions, the room no longer viewed her as an observer sitting at the end of the table. They viewed her as one of the most informed voices in the room. the only person who had not yet realized that seemed to be the man leading the meeting. The conversation that followed felt very different from everything that had happened earlier in the morning. Instead of directing every discussion back toward his presentation, Richard Collins now found himself sharing the room with a perspective that many people seemed eager to hear. Several board members began asking Monica follow-up questions. None of them were dramatic. They were the kinds of questions serious decision-makers asked when evaluating long-term opportunities. Monica answered each one with the same calm professionalism she had shown since arriving at the building. She never exaggerated. She never tried to dominate the conversation. She simply offered thoughtful analysis supported by experience. As the discussion continued, one director finally decided to address the issue that had been quietly lingering in the room. "Monica," he said carefully, "for context, would you mind sharing a little about your background for those who may not be familiar with your work?" The room immediately became silent. Ethan Brooks lowered his eyes toward the table. Several executives stopped writing notes. Richard remained standing near the screen, appearing mildly surprised by the question. Monica paused for a moment before responding. "Of course," she said. She closed her notebook and folded her hands. "I currently serve as managing partner at Summit Ridge Capital." The words landed quietly at first. Then several people visibly reacted. A few executives recognized the name immediately. Summit Ridge Capital was not a small investment group. It was one of the most respected firms in the country, known for backing major companies and helping shape entire industries. Monica continued, "My team focuses primarily on long-term strategic investments and corporate governance." One board member nodded slowly. Another executive suddenly sat straighter in his chair. Richard's expression remained controlled, but for the first time all morning, he appeared uncertain. Monica continued speaking in the same measured tone. "Over the past decade, I have worked with leadership teams across technology, healthcare, manufacturing, and financial services. Much of that work involves evaluating organizational culture, strategic execution, and risk management." The room remained completely quiet. Nobody interrupted. Nobody looked away. The information alone was impressive, but what affected people most was realizing how differently the morning might have unfolded if they had known this from the beginning. One of the directors who had researched Monica earlier finally spoke. "For clarity," he said, looking around the room, "Summit Ridge is the lead organization evaluating the proposed investment package, correct?" Monica nodded once. "Yes." The silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had happened all day. Several executives exchanged stunned glances. Ethan could almost hear people mentally replaying every interaction from the morning. The ignored questions, the dismissive comments, the seat at the end of the table, the repeated attempts to move past her observations. Richard slowly placed the presentation remote on the table. "I was not aware of that," he said carefully. Monica looked toward him. "That became apparent," she replied politely. Nobody laughed. Nobody moved. Her response was not hostile. It was not emotional. It was simply honest. And somehow that honesty carried more weight than any criticism could have. For the first time since the meeting began, Richard seemed to understand that the person he had spent hours overlooking was not merely attending the meeting. She was one of the people whose judgment could determine its outcome. The atmosphere inside the conference room changed instantly. Moments earlier, Richard Collins had been the unquestioned center of attention. Now every person at the table seemed focused on Monica Carter. The realization spread quietly but powerfully across the room. People were not simply learning who she was. They were realizing who she had been all morning. The woman whose questions had been dismissed. The woman who had been seated at the far end of the table. The woman whose observations had repeatedly been brushed aside was the very person leading the evaluation of the investment package everyone had been discussing for months. Richard cleared his throat and stepped away from the presentation screen. His confidence remained visible, but something underneath it had changed. "Well," he said with a small smile, "I wish we had been properly introduced earlier." Nobody responded. The comment seemed harmless, yet it failed to address what everyone had witnessed. Monica remained calm. Introductions are usually helpful, she replied. A few people lowered their eyes. The response was polite, but it carried enough truth to make the room uncomfortable. Richard pulled out a chair and finally sat down. It was the first time all morning that he appeared less interested in presenting and more interested in listening. I appreciate your insights, he said. You clearly bring significant experience to these discussions. Again, the words sounded professional. Again, they arrived far later than they should have. One board member quietly folded his hands on the table. Another executive stared at a spreadsheet without reading it. The shift in dynamics was impossible to ignore. Richard continued, "Perhaps we should spend some time discussing your perspective on our long-term strategy." Earlier in the meeting, Monica had offered multiple opportunities for exactly that conversation. Now the invitation sounded different. It sounded necessary. Monica looked around the room before answering. "My perspective has not changed since this morning," she said. "I asked questions because understanding leadership is an important part of understanding risk." Several board members nodded immediately. Richard forced a small smile. "Of course," Monica continued. "Financial models can be adjusted. Market conditions can improve. Operational challenges can be solved. Leadership culture is often much harder to change." The words landed heavily. Nobody needed further explanation. The room had witnessed the culture she was describing. Not through a policy document or presentation slide, but through real behavior unfolding in real time. Richard leaned forward. "I hope you understand that today may not reflect the full picture of our organization." It was the closest thing to a correction he had offered. Monica considered the statement carefully. "Perhaps," she said. "But meetings like this exist precisely because investors are trying to understand the full picture." Silence followed. Ethan Brooks could almost feel the tension. Nobody was speaking, yet everyone seemed to be processing the same realization. The discussion was no longer about projections, valuations, or growth targets. It was about judgment. It was about leadership. It was about whether the people guiding the company demonstrated the qualities they claimed to value. And for the first time all morning, Richard appeared to understand that the evaluation had never been limited to the business plan. The evaluation had included him. No one spoke for several seconds after Monica's last comment. The silence was not hostile. It was reflective. Every person in the room seemed to understand that the discussion had reached a point where numbers alone could no longer carry the meeting forward. Richard Collins looked around the table, searching for a way to regain momentum. "I think it is important to remember the tremendous progress this company has made," he said. "We have built a strong organization, delivered consistent growth, and created significant value." Nobody disagreed. The achievements were real. The challenge was that the conversation had moved beyond performance metrics. Monica nodded respectfully. "I agree," she said. "The company has accomplished impressive things." Several executives appeared relieved to hear her say it. Then she continued, "Which is why today's observations matter." The room grew quiet again. Richard leaned forward. "What exactly do you mean by that?" Monica answered without hesitation. "When Summit Ridge evaluates an opportunity, we look at more than financial projections. We examine how leadership responds to questions. We observe how different voices are treated. We pay attention to whether curiosity is encouraged or dismissed." Her tone remained calm. There was no accusation in her voice. That made the message even more difficult to dismiss. One board member slowly nodded. Another executive stared at the conference table. Richard attempted a careful smile. "I hope you are not suggesting that a few misunderstandings during a long meeting should outweigh years of successful execution." Monica met his gaze. "No," she said. "I am suggesting that small moments often reveal larger patterns." Nobody interrupted. The statement seemed to settle over the room. Richard looked down briefly before speaking again. "If there were moments today that felt dismissive, that certainly was not my intention." Several people shifted in their seats. It was the closest thing to an apology anyone had heard all morning. Monica listened carefully. "Intent matters," she replied. So does impact. The room became completely still. Ethan Brooks watched several board members exchange glances. Nobody appeared surprised by what Monica was saying. In fact, many seemed to be thinking the same thing. Richard took a slow breath. Then let me ask directly, he said. Based on everything you have seen today, what concerns you most? It was the first truly direct question he had asked her. Monica considered it for a moment. My greatest concern is not a financial model, she said. It is whether leadership recognizes valuable perspectives before knowing titles, positions, or influence. Nobody moved. Nobody looked away. Strong organizations attract talent from different backgrounds, experiences, and viewpoints, Monica continued. The best leaders listen first and make assumptions later. When that order is reversed, opportunities are often missed. Several board members nodded immediately. One executive quietly closed his laptop. Another set down his pen. The conversation no longer felt like an investment presentation. It felt like an honest assessment of leadership itself. Richard remained silent for several seconds. For perhaps the first time all day, he appeared to be listening without preparing a response. Monica then closed her notebook and placed both hands calmly on the table. The question every investor eventually asks is simple, she said. Can this leadership team be trusted with greater responsibility tomorrow than it has today? Her words hung in the room, and as everyone waited for what would come next, it became clear that the answer to that question would determine far more than any slide deck ever could. The room remained silent after Monica's question. No one seemed eager to answer it because everyone understood what was at stake. Richard Collins slowly leaned back in his chair. Earlier that morning, he had spoken with certainty about expansion plans, market leadership, and future growth. Now the discussion had narrowed to something far more difficult to measure. Judgment, trust, leadership. One of the board members finally spoke. What happens next in your evaluation process? He asked. Monica turned toward him. Normally, our team reviews financial performance, governance standards, leadership effectiveness, and organizational culture. Then we determine whether a partnership aligns with our long-term investment criteria. The answer was straightforward, yet everyone in the room understood its significance. This was no longer a hypothetical discussion. It was the process that would determine the future of the proposed investment. Richard folded his hands together. And based on what you have seen today? He asked carefully. Monica paused. She chose her words with precision. Based on what I have seen today, I believe the company possesses strong market potential. Several executives appeared encouraged by that statement. Then she continued. However, potential and readiness are not the same thing. The brief optimism disappeared. Monica looked around the table. Throughout this meeting, I observed talented people presenting thoughtful ideas. I observed board members asking important questions. I observed opportunities for meaningful discussion. She paused again. I also observed several opportunities that were dismissed without consideration. Nobody challenged the observation. Too many people had witnessed it themselves. Richard looked down at the table for a moment before speaking. If there are concerns about my leadership, I would welcome the opportunity to address them. Monica nodded. That willingness is important. Then she asked a question that immediately changed the atmosphere. If you had not learned who I was today, would this conversation be happening right now? The room became completely still. Several executives looked toward Richard. Others looked away. The question required no financial expertise. It required honesty. Richard opened his mouth to answer, then stopped. For the first time all day, he appeared genuinely uncertain. Monica did not press him. She did not need to. The silence itself revealed how difficult the question was. After several seconds, she continued. One of the most important responsibilities of leadership is recognizing value before it becomes obvious. Her voice remained calm. The strongest leaders do not wait for titles before showing respect. They do not wait for influence before listening. They do not wait for consequences before becoming curious. A board member slowly nodded. Another executive stared at his notes without writing anything. Monica closed her portfolio and placed it neatly on the table. "Our firm invests capital," she said. "But capital follows confidence. Confidence follows leadership. And leadership reveals itself in moments exactly like this one." Nobody interrupted. Nobody disagreed. Every person in the room understood what she was saying. The discussion had moved beyond spreadsheets, projections, and valuations. The investment decision was no longer being measured only in dollars. It was being measured in trust. And as Monica prepared to deliver her final assessment, everyone understood that the outcome was about to become very clear. Monica Carter looked around the conference room one final time before speaking. Every person at the table was focused on her. The presentations had ended. The projections had been reviewed. The questions had been asked. What remained was a decision. After reviewing the opportunity, meeting the leadership team, and observing today's discussions, Summit Ridge Capital has reached a conclusion, she said calmly. Nobody moved. Richard Collins sat silently across from her. The confidence that had defined the beginning of the meeting had long since faded. Monica continued. "The company has talented employees, a promising market position, and significant growth potential." Several executives listened carefully, hoping the statement might lead toward a positive outcome. Then she delivered the part they had all been waiting for. "However, we will not be moving forward with the proposed investment." The room fell completely silent. No one appeared shocked by the words themselves. Deep down, many had sensed this outcome approaching. What surprised them was how calmly it was delivered. There was no anger, no dramatic confrontation, no attempt to embarrass anyone, just a clear decision. Richard lowered his eyes for a moment. "May I ask why?" he said quietly. Monica nodded. "Because investment decisions are ultimately decisions about trust." She allowed the words to settle before continuing. "Money can help a company grow, cannot fix leadership weaknesses, cannot create respect where respect is missing, and it cannot replace judgment." Nobody spoke. Monica looked directly at Richard. "This decision is not based on a single comment or a single moment. It is based on a pattern I observed throughout the day." Richard listened without interruption. When questions were asked, curiosity was often treated as resistance. When perspectives were offered, some were valued more quickly than others. And when opportunities to listen appeared, they were frequently missed. The room remained silent. No one could honestly dispute what had happened. Monica gathered her portfolio and stood. "One lesson I have learned throughout my career is that people reveal their priorities long before they reveal their intentions." Several board members slowly nodded. One executive looked down at the table. Another stared toward the city skyline beyond the conference room windows. Monica smiled politely. "I genuinely hope the company succeeds. There are many capable people here who deserve success." Then she looked around the room one last time. "But leadership is measured by how people are treated before their influence is known, not after it is discovered." Nobody moved. Nobody had a response. The truth was too obvious. As Monica walked toward the door, Ethan Brooks quietly stood to open it for her. She thanked him with a smile and stepped into the hallway. The door closed gently behind her. Inside the conference room, the silence lingered. The meeting that had begun as a discussion about a major investment had ended as something entirely different. It had become a lesson, not about finance, not about valuation, not about growth, a lesson about assumptions, about listening, about respect. Months later, people would remember the missed opportunity and the capital that never arrived. But those who had been in the room would remember something else as well. They would remember that the most important person at the table had never demanded recognition, never raised her voice, and never tried to prove her worth. She had simply allowed everyone to reveal who they were. And in the end, that told her everything she needed to know.